My friends, we are now with Paulo Henrique Araujo, bringing us everything from Washington, from the White House. What's going on is that here in Brazil, Lula is calling Trump an imbecile. Lula is insulting Marco Rubio. Lula is going all in. Is Lula finally getting what he wanted, which is a political war with Trump to win votes in Brazil, or did he fall into a huge trap? All right, today with him, Paulo Henrique, here with me, writer, correspondent, international correspondent who speaks right directly from Washington. Welcome, my friend, to our channel.
Hello, Shimon. It's always a pleasure, and I'd also like to give a special greeting to your audience. We're here speaking directly from Washington, D.C., and let's start breaking down these topics, my friend. Let's go for it.
Very well, Paulo. So yesterday, Lula reacted, right? He reacted, by the way, to the decisions, to the directions that Trump and his administration decided to take. A few weeks ago, Lula had that feeling that everything was under control, that everything was handled after his visit. Although during the visit, I always say this here, he left that meeting at the White House with the look of someone who ate something and didn't like it. He wasn't happy, right? But he also didn't expect that Trump would come after him. Although, look at this paradox. He wanted that to happen. He wanted tariffs. He wanted a reason to curse Trump, to say that Trump is invading, is attacking Brazil's sovereignty. And in the end, Trump gave him what he wanted. But then we wonder, but did he really want it? Because now he's barking, he's angry, he's outraged. Because in a way, it was also a huge diplomatic humiliation, right? Flavio Bolsonaro goes there, and it's all a big coincidence, but there are no coincidences in this world, right? Flavio Bolsonaro goes there, and all these measures come out, including humiliating ones for Lula's government. And the one that came out yesterday is quite shocking, right? Because it links Lula's government with some companies, among them JBS and BD. With forced labor, right? Even slave labor. So, and this is exposed to the whole world, labeling Lula as a supporter of those who exploit workers. Look, the Workers' Party, right? Yeah, walking alongside those who exploit workers. And that's a blow to Lula's campaign. It's almost like a mercy shot, but I think there's still more to come. I think the silver bullet in Lula's campaign hasn't been fired yet. But everything is coming from Washington, and what's most interesting is that everything is coming against Lula from a place where Brazil's Supreme Court has no power. And Lula, poor guy, can't do absolutely anything, Paulo. How's the atmosphere there in the United States?
Look, Shimon, that's a great summary you brought, and there are some points we need to address based on that, right? Yeah, I think we can start with the National Security Program of the United States of America. Because the work I do with my team is very focused on geopolitics, international relations, but above all, the backstage of American politics, okay? What happens in the committees in Congress, the backstage of the White House, and all the behind the scenes stuff. So based on that, we started to observe we've already covered elections on the ground. Here in the United States, the Trump administration 2, which was being proposed, it would have some different paths. And there was a document from the Heritage Foundation called Project 2025. And Trump, when this project came to light, started saying, no, it has nothing to do with us. That's just a few extremist ideas. It's not what we're doing. But we went to study this project, almost 800 pages long. And what the Trump administration is doing is following this playbook. The Heritage Foundation, in fact, was the main arm, right? A very big think tank here in the United States that started working directly with the Reagan administration. And the Trump administration brought many aspects of its foreign policy based on the vision that the Heritage Foundation had. And this brought a very, very big difference, Shimon, from the perspective of the last 80 years, of American foreign policy, which since the end of World War II was very focused on the Indo-Pacific and later on the war on terror in the Middle East. But President Donald Trump did something that went against the understanding of many analysts, of geopolitics and international relations, which was a prediction I had been making since 2023, that this new Trump administration would pay much more attention to Latin America. And this became even clearer when he started speculating that his vice president would be a man named Marco Rubio. So it became much clearer. It was a prediction I had been making for a while. A prediction I had been making since 2004. It was a prediction I had been making since then, which ended up causing a split. We can talk about that another time. Within the context of the American administration, there is a civil war within the Republican Party today with two very distinct worldviews. But fate had it that Marco Rubio became the U.S. Secretary of State and the best person to work on this new vision that the United States is applying to its national security. And as they often say here, hemispheric security. So that's why we often have a sense that American foreign policy is schizophrenic today. On one side, you have a very intense fight with allies that puts the world under tension, especially in Europe, and a search for space in Latin America as a whole. And that's what the United States believes now. They launched the National Security Plan at the end of 2025. And in this National Security Plan, they placed the American continent as their key area of direct influence. And that's where we have several issues that will involve Brazil. Why? We had the launch of a structure that I affectionately call, curiously, it's the Miami Forum or the Doral Forum, which is the Shield of the Americas initiative. And what is the big question? As I told you, I write about the Sao Paulo Forum. I have published books about it. My main field of study is politics in Latin America, right? That's the area where I work the most besides American politics. And it was very clear that the American government, they neglected the continent for a long time. And when we look, for example, at trade indicators, many times political issues are dealt with only from that perspective. In 2000, the United States was the main trading partner of practically every country except for Cuba and a little bit Nicaragua in the year 2000. And when we look today, only Paraguay has the United States as its main trading partner. And they paved the way not only for China's entry here, but also for Russia's. And then come the issues of hybrid warfare, where we have mass immigration, human trafficking, drug trafficking, among other points. And several observers from the Heritage Foundation, the people from Florida, were paying attention to all of this and said, hey, wait a minute, we need to bring back what was the vision of the United States in the 19th century, the Monroe Doctrine. So much so that today it's called Donroe, which is a doctrine based on Donald Trump, right? And President Monroe from 1824. So what do we have then in the midst of all this, my dear? It's the United States redesigning. They're redesigning institutional relations, military relations, relations to combat organized crime, economic relations, and ideological relations on the continent, countries that essentially depend on the United States. They are being invited kindly, if you know what I mean, to take a stand, to switch sides. The biggest example we have of this is Panama. Panama is governed by a left-wing party, and its president has ties to the Sao Paulo Forum, founded by Lula and Fidel Castro. It essentially depends on the Panama Canal and on the United States, the American economy, the American banking system, to exist as a nation. Yeah, and this isn't a matter of sovereignty. No, it's nothing like that, but Panama has always been an important hub in that sense. The first international action taken by the American government, anyone can look this up, was to send Marco Rubio as soon as the Trump administration began, along with the Secretary of Defense at the time, now Secretary of War, Peter Ragseth, to Panama. And that's when a change began regarding who would have private jurisdiction. Above all, okay, because the United States uses its strength, its industry, as soft power through the Panama Canal. So Raul Molino, who is the president of Panama, had to make this change. But the American government, they used, as I said, soft power and brought in BlackRock to buy the ports on both sides of the canal, both on the Atlantic and on the Pacific side. And this was the starting point for a big change. So we can understand where Brazil fits into this scenario. because after that, they started making several arrests of major cartel leaders. And these cartel leaders, we could talk just about that someday too. Okay, Shimon, if you want. Yeah, what's behind Maduro, the cartel of the Suns, how all of this happened, why those people were arrested. But that's another topic, right? So we had organized crime, international drug trafficking being fought, which is directly connected to several government tentacles, okay? So we have drug cartels that are directly connected to the governments of Mexico, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. You end up in Brazil because you have branches like the Red Command and PCC. Go ahead, my friend. No, you already will.
You keep talking, right? Like a machine gun of knowledge. And it triggers memories for those who are following the story, right? It's almost like an audiobook with so much information. That's what you're bringing here. But yeah, I was going to say it's quite a coincidence, right? The cartels start to fall and the left starts to lose control of Latin America. It's quite a coincidence, right? You'd have to be 2 or 3 years old not to understand everything that's going on, folks. It's really impressive, the scale of the change, and you can tell the problem goes much deeper. And Lula's fear, right? Lula calling Trump an idiot. No, not idiot, imbecile. It's imbecile, right? It's not a show of power. It's a show of desperation because they know their days are numbered. Paulo, so it starts in Panama, then comes Venezuela and goes on, right? Things are moving along with the United States.
Yes, actually, Shimon, if you allow me here, sure. A little plug, but not really a plug because it's related to this. Yeah, today I'm going to launch an ebook and I'll publish it on my social media, mainly on Instagram and on my Twitter. My Twitter is Faraujo and on Instagram it's Faraujo Real. I'm going to release an ebook talking about this structure for fighting organized crime. Since this is happening in several places, I'm going to go over it quickly now. But it could reach Lula, even though he's not the main target of the United States, okay? If you want, check out my social media later.
It'll be on social media, right? I don't know if it's on Amazon or those things. If not, we would put it there. No,
it will be there. I'll leave it on social media. It will be free, okay? That's right, for everyone to download. I'll leave the instructions there. There will be, let's go, everyone.
Right.
So, yeah, but this started with such a deep chain of events that you started connecting it to several other situations. Why? Yeah, and then there's the whole structure, right? For example, of what I write, of my published books, for example, in the book, The Sao Paulo Forum and The Great Homeland. I keep bringing all this. It has to be here. I'm not making a big deal out of it.
Show it, because we're going to put it here for anyone who wants to buy it, okay? Look, guys, buy this book. I'll leave the button here.
It's prefaced by Ernesto Araujo, right? The former chancellor of Brazil. And in this book, I show these connections we have between Islamic jihadism, international drug trafficking, and arms trafficking. And these governments, right, which are coordinated from the top leadership of the PT itself. Okay? Yeah, that's a key point we have in all of this. So the American government starts to crack down on several things. And then you'll find specific connections, like, for example, the money laundering that was done by criminal groups, organized crime organizations, for jihadist groups. And you'll find connections between these jihadist groups and governments in the region, like the government of Peru, the government of Venezuela, the government of Nicaragua, the government of Bolivia, among others. So these are connections that,
Just to make it clear, guys, jihadists, Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, these are the groups. Boko Haram, these are the groups that the Latin American left, actually the global left, associates with, both here in Brazil, in the United States, in China, and in Russia.
Exactly. The issue with Russia is so deep that the resurgence of the Sao Paulo Forum and the rise to power that the left had after 2019 is directly connected to Vladimir Putin, okay? It's something that isn't discussed in Brazil, Shimon, but I've given lectures to the Latin American community with representatives and journalists. Recently, I even gave a lecture with the former vice president of Colombia, from the time of Álvaro Uribe. And it's very clear throughout the continent the role of Russia in this hybrid war, right? But in Brazil, this isn't widely discussed, right? It's something that on another occasion we could talk about just that.
For sure.
But for example, what we had then was the First Capital Command, the PCC, which has now been classified as an international terrorist organization. In fact, it takes effect starting this Friday. Now, on the 5th, right, this classification of theirs, they were laundering money, actually. They are laundering money through fintechs, okay? Banks, these virtual banks that are very common today all over the world, especially in Brazil, and that's a good thing, right? The problem isn't the companies. They are using fintechs to launder money for Hezbollah, okay? When we look at the trafficking structure, that's right. When we look at the arms trafficking structure, for example, we end up hitting Hezbollah, Iran, North Korea, all of this with the operation that came from the core of the São Paulo Forum with Maduro, among other things. So it starts to hit organized crime, the FARC, which are now called, right, ex-FARC mafia. You have the ELN, several groups here that are connected to international drug trafficking, which connects to the Los Soles cartel, which connects to Gustavo Petro, to Evo Morales, to Luis Arce in Bolivia, to the Castro family too. There are several investment schemes. So the web is gigantic, and you will always end up hitting the structure of the São Paulo Forum behind all of this.
Paulo, just forgive me. Look, you saying this, you're talking about it's almost like you're talking about the families that rule our continent. Because you see, there are these conspiracy theories that only mention the families from the United States, right? The Rockefellers, they mention BlackRock, they put Jews in the middle of these conspiracies, and never, notice this, never in these conspiracy theories, they talk about these guys that Paulo just mentioned who are connected all over the world, even in North Korea, right? Iran, even here, look, PCC, Comando Vermelho, then you ask, who's really running the world? Who's really running things here in Latin America? Who's in charge here in this hemisphere, right? So it's not just one side of the story. There's this other side too, but it's this other side that Paulo is bringing to us. Here, nobody talks about him, not even the creators of these conspiracy theories. They don't talk about these people that Paulo is naming here now, Paulo.
That's right, my friend. And all of this is documented, okay? For example, my book has almost 500 pages and it has almost 600 footnotes, interactive footnotes where you have audio, video, everything to prove what they themselves are saying and everything else. Things in Latin America are pretty dense, okay? It's pretty dense, and I think the language and geographic barriers, right? Brazil is much more turned toward the Atlantic, the population, and that ends up making this integration we have more difficult. So all of this is happening at the same time, and the web is starting to cross the Atlantic. It's reaching Madrid, it's reaching Spain, which has to do with this ebook I mentioned that I'm going to release today. I won't get into that because otherwise we'll be here for an hour.
Wow, that's a lot, right? But you mentioned Spain. Last week they caught the wife of, I don't know if it's the president or the prime minister there in Spain, but they caught her.
Of the former prime minister, no, of Sanchez, the wife of Sanchez.
That's right. They caught her in the scandal. But the main thing that stands out is this. Spain was sending industrial components for explosives to Hamas and Hezbollah. Do you get what's going on?
And then you look at Pedro Sanchez's international connections. Pedro Sanchez is an active member of the Socialist International. People think the Socialist International is a thing of the past, but it's not. That international of Marx, Engels, Rosa Luxemburg, Stalin, all of them, he's there, he's an active member. But that's how it is. And the thing is, where was Lula, Paulo? Where was Lula, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, right? Barcelona. I have an article that was published on the O Cruzeiro portal about this trip Lula took. Shimo, I can send you the link later, okay? Yeah, there's a lot of behind the scenes information about what happened there, right? This issue involving the São Paulo Forum, the people who were there, how all of this fits into the whole scenario I'm talking about here, right? About Latin America with you and your audience. But when we get to the issue of Spain, you're mainly going to focus on Zapatero, the former prime minister of Spain from the time when Lula was president in Brazil, alongside Chavez, the Kirchners, and everyone else in Latin America. But what's the main point going back, right? Your initial question, we have the United States saying that we need to fight this external influence and regain our influence over the continent. Because what happens? China, they have a military doctrine that Mao Zedong used during the civil war against the Kuomintang within the Republic of China to rise to power, which is to surround the big cities. They would take everything around the big cities and you cut off the supply lines and you surround them. And when you look at the map of the American continent, China has been doing this for the last two decades in a silent way. And it seems that the United States has finally realized that this was happening. What amazes me is the speed with which the administration Trump is managing to reverse this scenario, including from an electoral standpoint in all these countries. And now we have had a tariff framework as a soft power tool that changed things in Colombia. We recently had the election in Colombia, which is going to a runoff, but the left is virtually defeated, right? The Sao Paulo Forum will leave Colombia. And the United States had already worked on this issue with Brazil. When they announced tariffs on Brazil in July 2025, they already made it clear that they would also start an investigation under Section 301 of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Why? They identified that Brazil has several practices that harm American companies. And here, when we talk about this discourse of sovereignty and so on, we need to understand how Americans see things to see if what Lula, the PT, and part of the press are saying makes sense. And here, it's not a matter of, oh, I'm a vassal of the United States. No, because this isn't about taking sides. It's about understanding how Americans see things. The American perspective is as follows. They project their power in the world in two ways. The first is through a very strong military, okay? So in other words, that's hard power. And American soft power comes precisely from the structure of its industrial complex. In other words, the United States exports democracy, as they like to say, through its industry. And we see that the American industry is the largest in the world. If we look at the biggest technological developments, they're coming from American companies, not necessarily from American minds, but from American investment, right? So we have NVIDIA, we have Apple, and back then Intel, we have Tesla, SpaceX. Look at what that is, right? SpaceX. SpaceX today, in today's modern warfare landscape, SpaceX is something decisive. So, yeah, and that's not even mentioning the banking system and so many other points. So the United States says, what do we need to do? That our companies have competitiveness because China was working on several mechanisms to give themselves a strategic advantage through the ideological field. For example, Venezuela. Venezuela is completely broken with a dictatorship. China comes to Venezuela and says, look, I have some money here to help you, right? And how do you do it? Look, I don't care if you torture your people, if you kill, if you persecute, if you have political prisoners. That's your people's self-determination, okay? But I'm going to bring a lot of investments here for you. You don't have to answer to me as long as for what I want, you give me big discounts. And for the investments you sign here with me within your country, you accept the exorbitant interest rates I'm setting. And if you can't pay, you'll have to give me parts of your infrastructure, which is called debt trap diplomacy, a strategy that China has been applying. In fact, this is being applied in Brazil, okay? Brazil is actually doing this, including the grain terminal at the Port of Santos, which was a mistake in the way Tarcísio handled it when he was minister, right? Yeah, there is no privatization for another state. Privatization is for companies, not for an entity controlled by another state, especially the Chinese Communist Party, right? I think there could be more scrutiny on this issue. So China started paving the way with this, and the United States began to push back hard. For example, when we look at the oil issue today, what are the United States targeting? They are forcing China to work with market prices. Shimao, China used to buy oil from Venezuela with a 40% discount. Yes.
Buys from Iran. Buying from Iran comes with a 10% discount. From Russia also with a discount. Yeah.
60 from Russia, 60 for 60%. Hey, Paulo.
You said it, right? Look, the Trump administration is managing to undo the Chinese circus really fast because actually, Paulo, China doesn't have allies. It does exactly. It has bodies that it sucks all the energy from, right? That's it. It has hosts because it's an economic parasite, it's a cultural parasite. It comes, it sucks everything there, and then it leaves, or it becomes the owner, because that's happening in Africa actually, right? It becomes the owner of that place, that country. In other words, you don't make allies. You're a more terrible neo-colonialist than the Europeans, right? More terrible than what they accuse the United States of. So, since you don't have allies, you're going to fall, which is what's happening, right? They're collapsing. Just like here in Latin America, they collapsed in Iran. They collapsed. And another thing, too, China, they're not self sufficient in anything, right? Only in the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party itself, but they don't harvest anything at all. They don't have oil. They depend on foreign oil and foreign gas. They can't produce their own protein, their own meat. In other words, China is overwhelming, but it is highly dependent on the rest of the world. If you knock down one piece, the Communist Party already feels threatened. It's different from the United States. To put the United States in checkmate, you need a lot. To put China in checkmate, we're seeing that you don't need much, given the proportions, right? We have a war happening over there in the Gulf, control of the Strait of Hormuz. We have American advances in Latin America. But look, Trump is cornering China without firing a single shot at Xi Jinping.
That's right, my friend. And taking this point, there's only one area where China currently has a prevalence in the international market, and that's the big Achilles heel. And that's where we're going to talk about Brazil now. Let's, after making this whole introduction, get to the point, which is precisely the issue of rare earths, right?
Yeah.
Because since the early 1990s, when we look at the Chinese Communist Party's documentation, they were already paying a lot of attention to issues involving rare earths. And the American government, after the fall of the Soviet Union, in documents from 1992, China was already talking about this. And the United States was emerging then as a hegemonic power, right? We had the Gulf War, right? The first and second Gulf Wars happening. Then we had the War on Terror, and the United States, they stayed away from this issue. They didn't invest enough, and China kept growing in this area. What's the main point? Today, the United States of America is chasing after the world's largest rare earth reserves. But even so, they have a deficiency that can't be solved quickly, which is the processing of rare earths. Today, the United States only has a rare earth refining facility on the West Coast between Nevada and California. And that site, as they call it here, was deactivated. And the American government is having to put a lot of money into reactivating it and creating others here within its own territory. And what's the big problem we have in the middle of all this? Several environmental issues, environmental policy, right? Which were created as a trap, a straitjacket against the West itself since the time of Gorbachev.
With the Chinese and Russians, right?
With Chinese and Russian lobbying. That is exactly Shimon. So today the United States has to catch up with this. Which country has the second largest rare earth reserves in the world? Yes, Brazil. And Brazil ideologically with various types of contracts is tied, okay, to the Chinese. And the United States needs to bring Brazil to this side. It's just that the United States, they have some internal timing issues and internal politics here, which can't make it so that suddenly, as many people think, right? No, it's not just that suddenly it's Flavio Bolsonaro or another more right-wing candidate with a more pro-United States view gets elected and then everything is solved. It's not quite like that. There are internal issues in American politics like control of Congress that come into play here, and Trump has to race against that. That's why he adopted a strategy at the end of last year. Let's try to talk to the Lula government. And with that, they started working in a closer way. Like, look, we managed to control the chaos here, right? Even though it's a left-wing country, ideologically more distant, We're using our soft power here in small doses, and let's see what happens. But as the São Paulo Forum has always done, for those who study this part of Latin America well, I talk a lot about this in my book, they do what Lula does, talk because of Lula. He adopted the same strategy that he already used with Bush and with Obama back then, which instructed Dilma to do this, and other governments did the same. But with Trump, things didn't work out very well. So that's Lula. And look, but his presence did it in a specific way. And that's how he's going to do it. That's how he's going to do it. I went to the embassy's door and everything. So what do we have? Lula came and said, look, no, we have some disagreements. So I propose that we set up a working group for 30 days so we can resolve these issues. But Lula left that meeting discredited, okay? I'll recommend it later, Shimon. I'll even send you an article I wrote about this, which covers the behind-the-scenes details that the Brazilian media didn't show. How Lula was criticized in the American media and how the White House didn't support him, okay? The treatment given to other leaders, both on their social media and in their communication, the White House press office, didn't provide everything Brazil needed to be able to show in an election year, look, we're here in the world's greatest power. That didn't happen. And it's not a matter of rooting for one side. It's just instinct. We can gather data, compare it, and see what happened. But Lula, yeah, this is already a more specific analysis. It seems like he believes he's still in 2002 when he could say something that would just float around in the national press, and then with a lot of force, it would spread abroad. Nowadays, when Lula speaks, in 10 minutes, the video is on social media. In another 10, an artificial intelligence translates it. And in 10 more, it's on the Secretary of State's desk. If he says something foolish, it reaches top American officials in 30 minutes. And Lula, a week after the visit, with the way the media was treating him, he starts poking at Trump, criticizing Trump. And then the order inside the White House, and I was able to confirm this with some sources I have, they said the following: the order is not to engage in any public confrontation with the Brazilian government. We want to bring them to our side. Let's see what happens.
And there was a change, there was a real change from last year to now, right, in this strategy, and people can notice that. Remember, Trump used to talk about Lula. Trump used to talk about Bolsonaro. Trump criticized Moraes on social media himself. Marco Rubio also used to talk. The Brazilian embassy also used to talk. After the supposed agreement, they stopped directly criticizing Lula, right? The policies were made behind the scenes, so much so that the Brazilian press buried Bolsonarism, right? The Brazilian press, there's a video that's circulating again of Andrea Sadi saying, Flavio Bolsonaro, Bolsonarism is over, Bolsonarism is finished, and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, next to it, there's a photo of Flavio Bolsonaro with Trump, yeah, in the Oval Office.
That's right. But what happened? Then there were these 30 days. Okay, Shimon, what you said is really important, you know, man. There was that 30-day period Lula asked for. Exactly. 15 days after this visit that happened here in Washington, Lula took a measure that is one of the most scandalous in Brazil. And that's a problem because in Brazil, there are so many things happening that we just get caught up in the outrage of the day. The topic dies and everyone forgets. We can't forget. Lula signed an order to censor the electoral period in Brazil. He used a strategy which is signing a provisional measure, and this provisional measure is valid for 6 months before being discussed by Congress. He signed it exactly during the period when 6 months will cover the elections. And he regulated social media and practically the press in Brazil, because today the press goes through social media. And this was one of the major points of discussion between the United States and the Brazilian public administration. Yeah, you guys are not going to mess with our soft power. Remember what I explained at the beginning? Panama, the companies noticed that when Trump, I'm going to put this in a way that might sound wrong, but it's not. It's just to simplify. When he sold his vice president's seat, which went to J.J. Vance, the groups behind J.J. Vance are from the new Silicon Valley Mafia, as people call it, the Soundtex Mafia. Paulo.
Just to make it clear, guys, the owner of X, the owner of Twitter, the owner of that Instagram you use, right, of WhatsApp, the owners of YouTube, that's it. They were the ones who put the vice president in the White House. So what does Lula want to do? Lula wants to decrease the value of these companies because in the end, that's what it's all about. When you censor and control, it loses its value. Why? Because you're limiting who can use the social network. And it was made for as many people as possible to use at the same time. Look, a brand that advertises on a social media platform will cut back its spending there. Why? Because there won't be that many people watching anymore because the government is regulating it.
And Brazil has joined the ranks of countries like Russia, like Iran, like North Korea, right? We've joined a really nice group there.
Right.
A cool group of countries. Brazil sides with the axis of dictatorships, right? The United States is working to bring down this axis of dictatorships. It started with Venezuela, there's Cuba, and then there's the issue with Iran, right? That's happening in the middle of all this. So the day after Lula signs this provisional measure, an invitation comes up for Flavio Bolsonaro to come to the White House. That's true. What was the diplomatic message from the United States? Is that it? Do you think we're fools? All right, then. Let's invite your main opponent here. Let's invite him here. And notice that there really was a chill in relations, okay? In the relations between the Trump administration and the Bolsonaro family, let's put it that way, okay? Yeah, but when it was convenient for the United States, they reestablished that, and that's good for the opposition side. The opposition in Brazil as a whole, when we look at it, that's what politics is, right? Politics involves this. We have to have the maturity to look at this issue that way. So Flavio Bolsonaro was invited to come here to Washington, D.C. Flavio Bolsonaro's pre-candidacy adopted a strategy that I found very smart of plausible denial the whole time, right, about this visit. Yeah, I hear, Shimon, I'm accredited, okay? At the U.S. State Department, I went in, I talk, I have contacts inside. I spoke with the person who could give me information. He said nothing came to the State Department. That's what they told him. Talk to the people at the White House. I went to talk to the people at the White House. There's nothing here about that either. So I went to check. I went to talk to the Brazilian diplomat and everything to get and understand what the situation was there. And it became clear that this would be an off-the-record visit, meaning it wouldn't be done in the diplomatic way. It would be a personal visit, okay? Or it's a personal meeting of President Donald Trump. So much so that on his schedule, you know, we have this issue listed in a generic way, the meeting with Flavio. It wasn't clear it was that day. When Trump's schedule was released, there was just an hour left in Washington. We were already behind. I even wrote a post which was very controversial on X, where I explained the technical part of this, why it wasn't being addressed, and so on and so forth. Yeah, some groups, you know, we have groups now, everyone's joking around within the right and all that. They thought this would serve as a pretext for Flavio, who wasn't doing anything. And later, I was going to use what I wrote to validate why he didn't meet with Trump. And everything I wrote there happened exactly the way I described the diplomatic protocol, because I talked to several people, with Brazilian diplomats, with people in the United States, with the White House protocol, the State Department, and so on. So, Timon, what we had there was an important meeting. Later, I attended the senator's press conference here in Washington, and I even asked him a question about China. And what was the main point that Flavio left talking about? The shield of the Americas, which later, if you want, we can even do a show just to talk about the shields of the Americas, which is important, but the press in Brazil treats it as just an ideological meeting of right-wing presidents, and it's not. It's a geopolitical restructuring. And here, when we talk about geopolitics, the science of geopolitics, in practice, because geopolitics is based on assumptions, geography will define the direction for everything else in international relations. And here, this is geopolitics in practice, when we're talking about the shield of the Americas. And when he talked about this, it already caught my attention. The issue of China and organized crime. And I even said, I used the question I had to ask at the press conference about China. And later, I even did shows saying, look, the issue of organized crime is going to come down hard. You can find my show where I talked about this on the day of the visit and the next day, especially when he met with Christopher Landau, who is the #2 at the State Department. And then, surprisingly, Flavio Bolsonaro was called back to the White House to have a conversation there with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and with J.D. Vance, who is the vice president. The conversation with Marco Rubio from the State Department revolved around the fight against organized crime. And with J.D. Vance, it was about freedom of expression and freedom of communication for American companies. And it's already known that Flavio Bolsonaro brought reports on both topics, okay? And then we have another layer in the middle of all this, which was, look, what the American government was doing. The other layer was, okay, you don't want to talk, you don't want to do things the loving way. Go ahead, Senator. They came back with the issue of Section 301 with the tariffs, but then we have to take into account this whole construction of the vision. This is a summary of the summary I'm making, you see, Shimon? In these 40 minutes we've been talking here, man, this is a summary for us to understand the U.S. side, the U.S. perspective in the global scenario of all this. And here I'm not saying it's right or wrong. No, it's their perspective. So we have to understand their perspective in order to see where Brazil fits into this. So what do we have? The United States saying, now let's get back to it, putting pressure on you and using everything we have, including making the Brazilian people understand who's actually harming your own country. Good. And then there's this issue that will, for example, affect both investigations. The first one is about the 25% because they believe there are some issues that Brazil is working on, which creates unfair competition for American companies, especially when the Brazilian government, and we have to remember that the Brazilian government is based on 3 branches: Parliament, executive, the federal one, which is the presidency, and the judiciary. In other words, the Supreme Federal Court is part of the government, right? Sometimes we talk about it like it's just the president, but it's not. So the Brazilian government looked for ways for American companies to do something that they are strictly forbidden to do by the U.S. State Department. To break laws in the countries where they are authorized to operate. Keep this point in mind, okay? So the Brazilian government, regardless of the name of the government official, made American companies follow secret orders and break Brazil's own constitution. That's something they're not allowed to do. Okay, so that's what the Brazilian government, what the American government is basing itself on, among other things. And then yesterday we had another investigation that added 12.5 on top of all that. And this 12.5 was also based precisely on unfair competition. But in this case, it was about slave-like labor, mainly involving Chinese companies. Then we'll see. When I left Brazil at the beginning of the year, Shimon, what I saw the most, at least there in the state of São Paulo, were Chinese electric cars. I get here in the United States and there are no Chinese electric cars, okay? They're all Japanese, German, American, right? Okay? You don't see Chinese electric cars here. And when we look at Brazil, yeah, what is the government doing? They're giving the Chinese a competitive advantage. And where? In the production chain. For example, taking the Ford factory in Camaçari and turning it into a BYD factory, and they're not creating jobs for Brazilians like Volkswagen did in the past, like Fiat did, like Ford and Chevrolet did in ABC. No. They're importing semi-slave Chinese labor, just like they're doing in Africa. In Africa, it's even worse because the Chinese there are in command positions, physically punishing Black Africans, okay? Whipping and all that. That's what's happening on the east coast of Africa. So this has led to several investigations by the American government. Piracy practices, and then you run into the Chinese again in 25 de Março. That is piracy of American products, theft of industrial technology. All of this is being done by the Chinese with the complacency of the Brazilian government, which is doing nothing. And here's where it gets interesting, because it's very easy from an electoral point of view for Lula to come and put the blame on Flavio. And the point isn't that it's Flavio Bolsonaro. It could be Caiado. It could be Zima. Lula would blame anyone who was in that opposition position. But the Brazilian government was aware of the investigation into Ordinance 301 since July 2025. Celso Amorim, a high-ranking member of the São Paulo Forum, and actually Brazil's foreign minister, special advisor to Lula, said, no, but this issue with Section 301 is like dropping an atomic bomb to solve a minor thing. Yeah, and what did the Brazilian government do? Nothing. They said no, insisting it's about chemistry, not ideology, and suggested focusing on discussing the nation. What did the Brazilian government actually do? They didn't do anything to sit down, talk, or present solutions. Look, why are the United States unhappy here? Because of this point, that point, and that point. When we look deeper, Shimon, I'm just going to throw something out here for anyone who wants to research it further later, okay? It's because PT is not a regular political party. People make a mistake about that. PT has a broad structure, just like the Chinese Communist Party, the Cuban Communist Party, okay? Where they see themselves as an institution above the state and positions are just titles, okay? Since Lula returned to office, PT has started signing several strategic cooperation agreements with various communist parties around the world, okay? So you will have agreements and memorandums signed with the Communist Party of Vietnam, with the Communist Party of Angola, with the Communist Party of China, with the Cuban Communist Party. In all the signings, especially when Gleisi was president of PT, you will see Gleisi Hoffmann, president of PT, signing. And who is next to her? Monica Valente, wife of Delubio Soares, yes, the treasurer of the Mensalão scandal, okay? And more than that, executive director of the São Paulo Forum, okay? So all of this is documented. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is all documented. So when you take all of this into account, that's the main factor. This end that has to revolutionize this international power structure called the Workers' Party, where they operate, how they operate, and where their reach extends. That's why they weren't interested in making this realignment that Latin America is going through, which will get into the issue of the America's Shield, which we can talk about another day. So ideological interests come first. The ideological ties with the Chinese Communist Party, for example, come before the sovereignty of Brazil that they talk so much about, that they claim to be defending. So 2 months ago in April, the Treasury Department, the US equivalent of the Finance Ministry, did Brazil a favor, Shimon, and little is said about this. They got in touch with the Central Bank of Brazil and said, we're getting ready, okay, to sanction the Red Command, the PCC, and people connected to them as international terrorist groups. Why did they do that? Because where it will hit the hardest, where it will hurt the most is in the banking system. So they gave the central bank a 60-day notice. Do you see, was Flavio's visit scheduled? No. And the TV? No. Lula's visit wasn't scheduled yet. Look at how the Brazilian government had an opportunity. Forget about PT, right and left. I'm talking about Brazil, about the Brazilian government at this moment. The Brazilian government had several opportunities. If they gave a 60-day notice, what did the Brazilian government do when they notified the central bank? The president of the central bank, which is an independent agency, went and said, look, I received a notice here, government of Brazil, that there will be this sanction and so on. It's important for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to know something. What was presented? What was sought? Apparently, if anything was done, it wasn't enough for the Americans, far from it, because they enforced it. And they sat down, brought Lula in, did it the way Lula wanted, okay? He didn't talk to the press. No, we'll give you a month. And what did Lula do? The opposite of what he promised. He resorted to insults, cheap populism, among other things. So Lula and the PT are working precisely to destroy this important bridge we have in our relationship with the only country that's bigger than us on the continent, which is the United States. After the United States, Brazil is the continent's largest country economically and politically. Brazil is bigger than Canada, Mexico, and Argentina. But we behave like a small chauvinistic Codillo-style Latin American republic, right? Of Bolivarianism. And now it's very easy for you to say, Pix is from Brazil. No, because you're a traitor. We've reached a point where the president of Brazil preaches or encourages speeches calling for the assassination of political opponents. Some people still think we'll become Venezuela, but Brazil already has, and in some ways it's even worse. Only the economic situation hasn't reached that point yet, my friend. So the problem goes much deeper than that. What did the PT do in a year regarding the investigation of Ordinance 301? Nothing. What did the PT do when they received a 2-month warning about the issue involving the Comando Vermelho and the PCC? Nothing. They bet everything that they would try to turn things around in the meeting with Lula here. And Lula, in the political field, let his ideology make him destroy everything. And look at the size of the hole we're in. But politically, if you turn on Globo News, if you turn on the mainstream Brazilian media, they report everything from an ideological point of view. So where is it, huh? You? You might even find some great journalists in the mainstream media who will present this with sobriety, like Norival Santana over at CNN or Claudio Humberto at the Bandeirante Group. These are people who are still isolated voices in the mainstream media, but it only reaches a niche, not the general public, right? So the size of the problem we have in the midst of all this is behind this huge framework of what's happening on the continent, and the world is going through a realignment of the global order. And Brazil is, besides being on the wrong side of this story, Brazil is asleep at the wheel. And we could miss a huge opportunity that maybe our country will never recover from. I'm being very honest in saying this. Paulo, it's clear.
For those who pay closer attention, it's clear that Lula wants a rupture, right? It's not that Lula doesn't know what he's doing. Never think, right, that Lula doesn't know what he's doing. He wants this total break with the United States, but there won't be enough time. First, Trump doesn't have all that time, and Lula doesn't have all that time either. So Lula was counting on them that they would get reelected right now in 2026, and the United States would simply change presidents because Trump can't stay in office. Yeah, but nothing turned out the way they expected. And unlike Obama, Biden, even Bush, Trump is a personality, right? As a person and as an administrator and politician, totally outside the political context that Lula was used to dealing with. In the more than 20 years of the Workers' Party here in Brazil, Trump is such that a lot of people are angry at Trump, but they don't even know why, because they can't understand Trump. They can't get him because he's totally outside the academic playbook. I see a lot of geopolitical analysts who don't like Donald Trump, but why don't they like him? No, because he's stubborn, he's rude, because he's crazy, because he's aggressive. Okay, but what about Xi Jinping? Do you like him? Xi Jinping is all polished. He doesn't even smile. You don't know what he's thinking. So Trump, he's totally different. People go crazy because they don't know how to deal with him. The world press doesn't know how to deal with Trump. They don't know what Trump is thinking because sometimes he's yelling, sometimes he's saying, this guy is my best friend, and that's ambiguous, right? Yeah, and people hate that, right? Because you can't predict what he's going to do tomorrow, right? And Lula goes crazy. The left gets frantic. Yeah, anyway. So we're seeing a superpower with a very brave guy. Because if there's one thing that Trump showed the world, it's that he has the courage to carry out his plans, right? Not everything he says he's actually going to do, because if you understand Trump even a little, he uses that to control the narrative all the time, saying what he wants, right? The press is talking about him because he wants attention and can handle it, right? So it's kind of like, man, he has a certain control of the situation, courage, not just that. He's kind of a guy who has a certain control over the global situation, not just inside the United States, but globally. He has some control, over what they're doing up to this point. Now, you just gave a geopolitics lesson so people can understand this map of what's happening. No, it's not just about PT and Trump. It's not just about Lula and the United States, but about a change that's happening. Maybe it's not happening yet, Paulo. We're in the middle of the change, and Brazil is the last frontier of the São Paulo Forum. And it would be one of the last problems that the United States has to solve here on the continent, in the hemisphere, before entering a broader war with China, right? And to face the Chinese, they need to have their house in order, right? And then there's all of this playing out. Later, I want to have you back on so we can talk about the Chinese presence here in Brazil, right? Which is really, really big. People have no idea how much Brazil is being influenced. And it's not with good intentions, folks, okay? Nothing good is coming. Yeah, nothing good is coming. Não vem nada bom. From the Chinese Communist Party, not even the Chinese themselves can stand the Communist Party. The Communist Party's hunger for power, right? For control. 40% of young Chinese are unemployed, right? Why do you think China sends this bunch of Chinese people to work in other countries, Paulo, right? Why does China need to send these Chinese people abroad? Labor to work even in construction there, right? Because there isn't that much work in China. The Chinese economy is staggering. And after this change here, look, in Latin America, because look, without cheap oil, without cheap energy, China can't produce the same things and can't deliver products at the same price the world used to buy from them. Well, if China starts selling products at the same price as the American market, why would a big company open factories in China if the price is the same? I'll just build my industrial base right here, because that's what they did, right? They replaced other countries' industrial bases with China's industrial base. But China depends on selling cheap products to keep their perfect Chinese world going over there in their territory. And Trump completely disrupted that, Paulo. So it's change happening in real time, and you all are witnessing it. And Paulo brought us today this impressive analysis of what's going to happen. Because by understanding what happened, we can already get a sense of what's going to happen in the coming months. And it's a lot, right? This classification of Brazil as a government, right, hostile to the United States, is much more serious. Why? Because this gives the United States some prerogatives to take more forceful actions to suffocate the Brazilian regime, Paulo.
Exactly, my dear, exactly. Look, we've left a lot of loose ends here, right? A lot. On several issues here. It's up to you, my dear. Choose one, we'll throw it up and start talking about it, my old friend.
Exactly. Paulo, I want to thank you for being here on our channel for this chat. Follow along there. Paulo, please tell us your social media. I think a lot of people who follow me already follow your work, but for those who might not be following you yet, they can follow you directly from Washington, folks. We don't have reliable correspondence in the traditional media today, okay? We have correspondents there in Washington who just watch what Trump is going to eat for lunch, giving out dinner menus. But when it comes to providing geopolitical analysis, Paulo is one of the most reliable. It's a sober, clear, and intelligent analysis of what's going to happen. So follow Paulo over there. Go ahead, Paulo, share your social media and show your book too so people can buy it.
Perfect, man. I'll start with the books. I have 5 books published, right? One of them is United States and the Shadow Party, but I have 2 here with me.
Okay.
This one is The Fall of Democracy in Brazil.
Let's put it here so you can see. On board.
Guys. And this one here is my big project, right? The São Paulo Forum and the Great Homeland, with a foreword by Ernesto Araújo, former Chancellor of Brazil.
Wow.
Shimon, for those who want to follow, I have 2 channels on YouTube, okay? It's PHPH Vox Geopolitics Made Simple, which is the more in-depth work similar to what we're doing here, right? Like we're talking expanding. These are daily live streams that we do with me, with Ivan Kleber, with Mr. Sepulveda, right? So we have one person in London, one here in the United States, and another in Portugal. And there's another channel with shorter videos about more specific topics, videos that are about 7 to 12 minutes long, called PH Araujo in the United States. So PH Araujo in the US and PH Vox. By looking for these two channels, you'll be well informed about what's happening, in addition, of course, to everything that's produced here on Strategic Briefing with Shimon Oliveira. I like Strategic Briefing. The name is really good, you know?
Awesome. Hey, Paulo, soon we'll be together there in the United States. Who knows, right? Who knows? Who knows? That's right.
That's right, my friend.
Hey, guys, so go follow Paulo. He has the books. I'll even leave the cards here for you to get Paulo's books. That's how we fund the truth. That's how we fund the work he does there and the work we do here. You guys should subscribe too. Here's the QR code on the screen for our intelligence bunker, where there's no censorship. We can name names. There we can say names. We can name names freely because a signature can't take us off the air. So here's the QR code, link in the description and in the first pinned comment. We also have a series and movies channel with recommendations, so you won't waste time searching for something great to watch. So subscribe to our series and movies channel. No woke culture, no whining, everything ready for you. Go there and enjoy the recommendation. Leave your like, subscribe to this channel, turn on the notification bell, and shield your mind. I'm Shimon Oliveira. Paulo talked to us today, and I'll see you in the next video. See you then.